So, guys, I'm joining you from our company, Informed Decisions. And what we do is we provide economic and population data for pretty much every local government in Australia. So, local governments and RDAs will subscribe to our tools. And what that allows people to do is it allows people to look at your economy and your community over time, see how it's changing, and try and create policy and projects that might either support some of the positive outcomes you can see coming along, or of course, overcome any challenges that you might see in your local economy. So we've got a few tools that we use. Why is this not moving forward? There we go. We've got a few tools that customers can subscribe to. And the two that we're going to be looking at today and focusing on are the community profile, which is the red circle there at the top, and of course the economic profile, which is the green directly below that. And both of those tools are really important. One looks at your community, so the people that live in your community, and the other one looks at your economy, which is also really, really important. And I guess the beauty of our data is every year we update that economic profile to reflect what has occurred in the previous year. So that's why it's really important to get, I guess, these state of the region updates to allow you guys to have a look at what changes are taking place and whether or not there's something there that can support some of the work that you're doing going forward as well. So the first thing I'm going to do, and the presentation today will only take probably 20 minutes to half an hour because I've really zoned in on the areas that I think are important for you guys to know. But the first thing we're going to do is just quickly look at the national snapshot, okay, just to see where we are at the moment. And one of the things that we've seen since COVID is that regional Australia, being less exposed to COVID-19, has benefited clearly since COVID. And we can see there in the Northern Territory, we can see the rest of the NT economic growth much stronger than Greater Darwin, where we see a very different industry mix. So those areas that have mining and agriculture have certainly seen the benefits of the different events which took place during COVID, different pricing, different demand for goods and services and things like that. So your industry mix really played a role during that period just as much as did your exposure to those COVID-19 restrictions and outbreaks as well. The other thing we're seeing at the moment, and we hear a lot about this in the news as we watch very closely what the RBA is doing every month, higher interest rates are certainly having an impact on household spending. And being a mortgage holder myself, I'm hoping that their spate of interest rate rises is certainly coming to an end, or we're close to the end of those interest rate rises. But we can see our household spending is actually reacting nicely to the work that the RBA is doing to bring inflation back around that 2 to 3% in the economy. So we can see household spending declining as well. One of the things we are seeing that I think is going to be really important for the NT as well is after the biggest shock since World War I, where we saw negative population growth in Australia, we've seen a very strong recovery in overseas migration. And that's really, really important. And it's going to be important for our regional economies to take advantage of that skilled labour that's coming into the country, starting to fill those gaps that we're seeing in things like healthcare, construction, mining, where we're finding it difficult to find jobs. Now, I've just flicked forward there. You may not have noticed that, but where we had originally thought after COVID, or sort of in that 2023, 2024 period when the borders opened, we would see international migration return to sort of a long run level of about 200,000 migrants per year. We've actually revised that up to 235,000. And if you read Glenn Capiano's recent blog that came out from ID looking at international migration, the year-on-year figure is sitting around between 400 to 450,000, which is the highest in Australia's history. So something really to think about when we think about our policy making and filling those skills gaps in our communities. What role can migration play in that story as well? Okay, so let's have a look at the Northern Territory story. Now, before we really crack in, I wanted to, because every time I give these presentations to you guys, we get confused about geographies because the NT is a lot more complex than other states and territories around Australia. Our RDA NT area covers all of those LGAs. Okay, so you can see that list there. I've broken down, and on the ID site, we've actually broken down our data into 3 specific areas as well. So we've got these overlay areas that we look at, and we can see there's the Big Rivers area, the Central Australia area, and the wider Darwin area. So I just wanted to give you that picture because as we move through the presentation, I'm going to pull out data from each of those areas so we can kind of compare. But I really wanted you guys to have a good idea in the presentation of exactly the areas that I'm talking about, because it'll be the #1 question that comes back to me after the presentation. So here's our Northern Territory population growth. Okay, and we've had very stable growth between 2013 to 21. So we've only had slight offshoots of growth during that period. And our population at the moment stands at 250,219 people, grown by 2,068 from the previous year. So we can see our population growth over time. We've had a little shoot there between 21 and 22. This is our percentage change in ERP, okay? And what I'm doing here is I'm comparing the Northern Territory to Australia, because what I want to look at is, are we growing at a slower rate or a faster rate than the rest of Australia? And we can see there in 18 and 19, we actually had negative population growth in the Northern Territory, whereas over the last three years, 2020 through to 2022, we've actually had positive growth during that period. In 2021, we actually outpaced the rest of Australia. So interesting stats there when we look at where we've come from. We can also see in 2007 through to 2013, when we had some very major projects going on in the Northern Territory, we can see that the rate of population growth in our community grew much faster than the rest of Australia as well. So it's nice to see that positive growth starting to come back, but and I know the NT government does a lot of work around population attraction and things like that, and that's a story that we need to continually sell because it'll help us with our jobs growth as well. One of the other things we want to look at when we get our new census data is looking at our age structures. So really thinking about, well, what sort of services are we providing to our community based on the demographics of our areas? And we can see here, and you can break this down for your local government area as well, guys. So absolutely go online and do that. And after the presentation, I'll get Jack to send out the links to the RDA NT site, which will be really helpful in your work. You can see here very, very strong in our young working population. So we can see there from sort of 25 to 45, very, very strong in the NT. So it's a much younger population. And with that comes our kids. So we can see there 0 to 4, 5 to 9-year-olds, 10 to 14-year-olds, all outpacing the rest of Australia. Where we start to see it fall away is once we hit the 50s. Okay, and we can see people in the latter part of their workforce, early retirement, and of course retirement, we see a lot less in the NT compared to the rest of Australia. What we also want to look at is, well, how is that changing over time? Okay, because that's really important. So yes, we've got our dominant age groups, which are our younger population in our community, but what we also want to look at, but how is that changing? And we can see in the NT that shift towards the aging in our population. Okay, and that's something to really think about because that presents a different type of service delivery, different products, talks to us a lot about our healthcare, safety in our communities, things like that. So we can start to see where perhaps some of our policy may need to shift. And it's important that if we see an ageing of the population, that we also see the required government funding going into service delivery to support the ageing in our population as well. And some communities have done it really well. Being based in Queensland, we have, some very notable retirement communities, like, say, for example, the Fraser Coast and Hervey Bay, Bundaberg, places like that, where people move to for retirement. And on the back of that shift and change in population, they've been able to build very strong, robust health systems which support the whole demographic, so from 0 to 4 out to our 85 and overs. So it's an important statistic and an important shift in your age structure that you can certainly use to your advantage. Now, what I've done, remember we talked about those different areas and different geographies. I've broken this down into wider Darwin at the top here, which very much follows a similar pattern to the rest of to the RDA NT area as a whole. So very much similar to the Northern Territory stats. When we look at Central Australia, a little bit different. We can see we've obviously got some projects, particularly, supporting that 25 to 39 year age group, because we can see over 400 people in each of those categories, 30 to 34 and 35 to 39. And same with the big rivers. So we can see in the big rivers that younger working population moving into those areas, and just a slight amount of aging in that population. But certainly we can see aging in both Central Australia, big rivers, as well as that wider Darwin area as well. So there's some important stats to note. So when you're looking at your particular area, this is why it's really important to break down according to your LGA or your overlay in terms of big rivers or Central Australia, because we really need to have a look at what's happening at that smaller level, at smaller geography level. This is what's happening in terms of the economy, and this is the highest growth since the series began in 2001. So we can see the NT is performing really well in terms of your wealth in your community. So when we talk about GRP, we're talking about wealth, okay? And that growth between 21 and 22, $1.3 billion. So what we do, guys, is we get this data. So each year, I'll get this data for each of my clients, and I'll look at it and I'll say, okay, the Northern Territory between 21 and 22 has performed really well. And actually over time, you can see how the NT has significantly grown their economy since 2001. And then what we start to do is we start to think about, well, what is driving some of that growth as well? So we can also see here that the NT is growing faster. Sorry, that should say Australia, faster than Australia in 2022, 5.2% versus 3.7% at the national level. Okay, so the NT is outperforming Australia. But if you look in 2021, we actually fell under the Australian growth rate. So we've had a very significant and very strong growth in between 21 and 22. We can see here some differences in the places that are driving that growth. And if you remember back to that national story, and we talked about how regional NT was driving a lot of the positive growth in the Northern Territory, you can see here the difference between big rivers and wider Darwin. So we can see wider Darwin has really, yes, there's been some growth between 21 and 22, but it's really plateaued since 2017-18. Okay, whereas we can see in the big rivers, they've had very strong year-on-year growth from 2019. So once again, really important to look at those differences, because it talks to us about what projects that might be delivered in those areas that we need to keep an eye on, the value of mining, the value of agriculture and things like that. Whereas wider Darwin has been hit in terms of education, accommodation, retail, things like that as well. So it's that different industry mix in your community. So this is the Northern Territory value add. So these are the industries where we see the dark green. This is the Northern Territory, and the sort of light green is Australia. This here is talking to us about what industries in the NT provide the greatest amount of profit. And we can see mining, public admin and safety, and healthcare and social assistance. And each of these outperform the rest of Australia. Okay, they are the most profitable industries in the NT. So they're industries that you need to take, you need to look after. The other thing you need to also look at is, well, what are some of the industries where we're falling behind quite significantly the rest of Australia? And we look here, and I can pick 2 or 3 immediately. We've got information, media and telecommunications, finance and insurance services, and professional scientific tech services. Those 3 areas provide a really nice multiplier in your economy, which means they provide a nice, I guess, indirect economic benefit for the rest of your community. So they're 3 areas that if you were talking to the state government that you would want to look at and say, okay, we want to really build some capacity in these 3 areas. Okay. When we look here at what is driving that growth, so remember I think we talked about $1.3 billion of growth between 21 and 22. We can see most of that is being driven by mining. We can see healthcare and manufacturing, and we also can see some other small little green shoots across the board as well. Okay, but really it's that mining factor. And we can see this in lots of mining regions that I go to. So you guys aren't out there on your own. Most mining communities that I go to at the moment, or agriculture, we're a bit of a one-horse town. But certainly it's nice to see that over that year, you've also had these little green shoots across the board, particularly healthcare and manufacturing as well. So they're really important industries to continue to grow, particularly when you can see that change in your demographic of your population. Okay, healthcare and social assistance is going to be really important. Now, this is a bit of a spotlight on your healthcare and social assistance areas. And the reason why I do this is because, and you can do this all through the tool. So if you notice, if those of you who use the tool quite frequently, I'm actually just grabbing slides and data directly out of the tool. And it's to help you guys, to show you, and so you can visualize exactly what I'm talking about. So there's ways of being able to drill down specifically into particular industries. And healthcare and social assistance is one of those areas that I've grabbed for you guys simply because of that change in your demographic. Okay, and I've looked at it over the last 10 years, because if you look at your charts at the bottom, you can see we've got a time series of employment. So this is your employment totals, and I can look at this from 2006 right through to 2022. Okay, we can also look at your value add, which is the wealth in your healthcare and social assistance sector, and we can see from 2006 through to 2022 we've had some very strong growth in that area as well. Now at the top I've broken it down by numbers and by subsector, and we can see the healthcare and social assistance sector grew by 986 million, and we can see how that's broken down between hospitals, medical and other healthcare services, which might be things like oncology services, diabetes clinics, things like that. Then we've got our residential care services, and of course we've got our social assistance services, which is things like NDIS. Okay, the greatest amount of growth we've seen through that period is with our social assistance services. Okay, the good news is we've seen growth across the board, which we should, because it's a 10-year period. And we need to really keep an eye on that going forward. Okay, simply because we need, given your change in your demographic, we need to see increasing service delivery, particularly in these top 3: hospitals, medical and other healthcare services, and residential care services. It's part of that package of being able to attract people to the NT as well. And just recently I was giving a presentation actually in regional New South Wales, and we talked about healthcare and the spectrum of healthcare services that you need to deliver in order to be a community that you can be born in, as well as, end of life in those areas as well. So making sure that we've got, everything from birthing services right through to palliative care type services in your community, so people can stay and live out their lives in the NT as well. So some interesting stats there. So certainly it's social assistance services that's driving our healthcare. So it's important to look and really drill down, because we really want our hospitals and medical and other healthcare services boosting a lot of that growth in healthcare as well. So we need to focus a lot of attention there in that area. Okay, this is our employment by industry. And you'll see from my previous slides that we saw wealth was increasing in the Northern Territory, but here we can see we've had a little bit of job decline, and particularly from 2017 to 2022, our job losses, 8,961. Now, I want to really caveat this, because at the moment we are seeing a very tight labour market. So I'm not denying that in a lot of regional areas there are jobs available. So if I moved to the NT tomorrow and I wanted to work, I would probably be able to get a job. I have no doubt. So some of these figures in 2022, this is about jobs that are filled, not jobs that are available. So when we think about what's available in our healthcare sector, our construction industry, retail, accommodation, food services, and things like that, that number could certainly be bolstered if we had the desire and the working population to be able to deliver in those areas as well. So that's just a caveat on the last couple of years. We've certainly, that tight labour market has made a big difference in terms of our actual filled job numbers in our community. So this is where we employ everyone. So public admin and safety, we can see there, very strong compared to the rest of Australia. Healthcare and social assistance, education and training. Okay, having a university certainly bolsters that for the region as well. Okay, so that's where we've got our job numbers. Now we want to see where some of those declines have been happening. Now I've chosen the time period, the last 5 years, because when we go back to here, we can see it's kind of the last 5 years where we've started to see those declines. So I really wanted to have a look at, well, what's happened over the last 5 years to ascertain sort of those changes that have taken place in your jobs market. And we can see there a lot of that activity or that change in terms of our job losses has happened in our construction industry, as major projects have, the timing has changed, things like that. And we can also see the mining sector there as well, as we've got more people, we're making more money with less people in our mining as well. We've had growth in our healthcare and social assistance, which is good to see, and we saw that growth in the previous slides as well. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Sorry, I thought I had someone asking a question then. That's okay. Here we've got our job seeker for the Northern Territory, and I love this data. Okay, I don't love labour force survey data, so our unemployment data, even though I'll show you a slide on it, I don't really like it at the very small area level. So when we're looking at Alice Springs, for example, I wouldn't particularly use the unemployment rate. I would look at what's happening in terms of our job seeker and youth allowance recipients. And we can see here, this is, you can choose different time periods in this. So I also looked at the peak of COVID, March to July, and I saw we had an additional 6,500 people accessing job seeker or youth allowance payments for the Northern Territory, which is a lot. Okay, and that happened everywhere. Right now in the Northern Territory, since March 2020, we've got an additional 3,795, which is a bit unusual. So most areas where I'm visiting at the moment, the number is almost back or better than the figure that we saw in March 2020. So still having 3,795 additional people since that time period accessing job seeker or youth allowance sort of stands out to me and makes me think, okay, what's happening in our communities? And we can see a lot of the areas where we have an increase are more Indigenous based areas. So whether there's something happening there with funding, I'm not 100% sure, but we can see West Armand, West Daly, unincorporated NT, all significantly higher. Roper Golf, McDonnell, Litchfield, East Arnhem. So those sorts of areas. Whereas when we look at places like Alice Springs, that number has declined since March 2020. So these are people who are accessing across the table payments, which is why I like this data, because it comes through very clearly those people that are actually accessing those payments. The difference here between this and the labour force survey data is, I think with job seeker you can work up to 10 hours a week or something like that. So they may be partially employed, which is why we see that difference between the two data sets. But this comes from the Department of Social Services, and it is a good way of being able to monitor jobs in your community and people accessing job seeker and youth allowance on a monthly basis. So this data is updated monthly, which is one of the reasons why I like it as well, is because you can really capture things quite quickly when there's changes in your local economy and in your local jobs. This is your unemployment rate. So we can see here, certainly above the Australian rate at the moment. So we can see Northern Territory a little bit higher than Australia there, but still very low. So when we're thinking about unemployment, it is actually still quite low. And we can see particularly from those peaks there during the COVID period as well. So we still do have quite a considerably low unemployment rate in this country and in the NT. The good news is when we look at our total building approvals, and I often look at building approvals to ascertain perhaps what might come to fruition, particularly around our construction sector, our wealth in our community moving forward, by looking at what's happening in our building approvals. And we can see there 2021, 2021-22, 2022-23, high levels of non-residential building approvals moving through. So that's your light green. And then, of course, you've got your green below, which is your residential building approvals, which are also very important, particularly in a market where we're seeing very low vacancy rates and that sort of thing. But the light green also, the thing I like about the light green is it also talks to us about jobs moving forward, because often the light green talks to us about investment in say, for example, medical facilities, hospitals, schools, commercial spaces, things like that. So it talks to us about jobs moving forward as well, which is really great to see. This is probably the best building approvals chart I've seen of any of the local governments I've visited over the last 6 months. So certainly performing well there in terms of what's getting through. Speaking of housing, so housing is probably the #1 topic facing regional communities all over Australia at the moment. So I think I've visited about 80 councils over the last 6 months, and RDAs, of course, as well as part of that visitation program. And we can see here, this is one of the areas that we've really focused. So it is on the housing. So here what I'm looking at for the NT is what sort of household types do we have? Okay, and mostly in the NT, it's couples with children, which is of no surprise because when we looked at your demographic data, it was a much younger population. Okay, so couples with children is our #1, followed by couples without children. And in the NT, I suspect some of these couples without children would be young couples without children. Okay, not just retired couples. So if this was a Bundaberg, I would be looking at this and saying, okay, that's perhaps made up of a lot of older residents in the community as well. Children have left home, things like that. People have moved to Bundy for retirement. But in the NT, I think that's a real mix. Then, of course, we've got our lone person household, which comes in third. So we've got couples with children, couples without children, and our lone person household. Now, here's where we're breaking it down by region again, okay? Because I want to see, well, what has changed in those communities? So this is our change in our household type. Okay, so I don't want to confuse you. I'm looking at big rivers at the moment, and we can see we've had this increase in one parent families in big rivers and group households. So very, very different. So when we're talking about what's happening at the NT level, this here is quite different to other areas. So we can see the big rivers is very different to, say, for example, what we're seeing in our change in our household type in Central Australia, where the main change is around lone person. So for big rivers, one parent families; for Central Australia, lone person; for wider Darwin, lone person. So when we're thinking about what product or what sort of residential developments do we need to do in each of these areas, it's going to have to be very unique to those particular localities. Okay, so where here we can see couples with children, one parent families, and lone person. It's an absolute mix of households. Okay, so you're thinking about, okay, we're building 3 and 4 bedroom homes, as well as perhaps unit developments and things like that for lone person households. Here in wider Darwin, once again, it's this lone person household. So thinking about, okay, what mix of dwellings are we providing? We've got our one parent families and our lone person there leading the charge. Interesting on the one parent families. Okay, so during COVID, we saw things like the separation of parents, and that's another, I guess, element of the housing situation that we're in at the moment, is where we traditionally needed one home, we now need 2 homes. Okay, so the increase in one parent families has actually, provided another barrier to the housing sector, as we've got split families taking up 2 homes rather than 1 home as well. But certainly in the wider Darwin and Central Australia area, this lone person household, which could be made up of once again in a place like the Northern Territory, young people as well as people aging in place, and it's really important to provide the right accommodation styles for that particular element of the community, because we can see significant numbers across Australia in that lone person category. This is our household size. Now, what I've done here is this is the Northern Territory, so mainly 1 and 2 person households. Okay, then when we look at our change in our household size, mainly 1 and 2 person households in the Northern Territory, but look at big rivers. Big rivers is 2 and 5 person households. Okay, so we've got Northern Territory, we are mainly 1 and 2 person households, but when we look at that change between 16 and 21, 1 and 2 person households is what is driving most of that change. And then when we look at big rivers, it's 2 and 5 person households. So just noting that difference between those, the specific areas as we break it down. This is the housing supply. So this is what we currently provide. Okay, so at the moment in the NT, you guys actually provide a nice mix. Okay, partially that's because you are a tourist location as well. Okay, so you provide things like high density, which is good to see, but you can see that separate house right through to caravans, cabins, houseboats. Here's our change in our dwelling structure between 16 and 21. So this is what we are creating, mainly separate house and high density. Okay, so high density caters for perhaps our couples and our 1 person households, which is good to see. This separate house helps us to attract families to the region and also supports the younger people in our community as well. Those young families that are living there and looking for a home, a house to live in with a little bit of land. It's a great feature of being able to live in regional Australia. When we look at our change in our dwelling structure in Central Australia, we can see separate houses, a little bit of medium density, and we can see this caravan, cabins and houseboats, which potentially is people visiting during that 2021 period with COVID, people traveling through our communities. The change in the other is to do with the changes to the way the ABS is calculating households. So we made a note of that. I visited a town in outback New South Wales, and they had a significant decline in other, and they didn't obviously lose structures. It was just the way the ABS was counting properties in the area. Last couple of slides, guys. Here we've got our vacancy rates, and I've just chosen the city of Darwin. Okay, so you can actually go onto this website. I really like it. It's called SQM Research. So you can Google that and go online and have a look, and you can actually select postcodes. So you can break it down by postcodes, but it gives you a really good idea of what's happening in your housing market, which I really, really like. And we can see here, you know, vacancy rates under 2%. Since 2020, really. So we can see that fall, and we've had those very, very low vacancy rates in the city of Darwin. And you can actually break it down by sort of northern NT, southern NT, and Darwin. So it would be worth going on and having a look for your particular area as well. This also looks at the weekly rents. So not only are we seeing very low vacancy rates, we've also seen rents lifting in the community since 2020 as well. So you're sort of squeezing your renters as well. And one of the things that the work that we've been doing around housing and housing pressure and things like that is where we're seeing the greatest amount of housing pressure is in our single lone person households in the older demographic. So certainly my heart goes out to mortgage holders, because I'm a mortgage holder and I feel that pain. However, where we're seeing the greatest amount of housing stress is in that older lone person rental market as well, which when you look at the data totally makes sense. They're being squeezed in terms of rentals. A lot of them are on a set pension. So it's not like they have the ability to go out and earn additional money to make up the difference in the rental prices as well. So certainly one to watch in the community. Here's a little bit on tourism. Okay, and we can see here we're starting to see our tourist sector come back. Okay, both in terms of our direct and indirect impacts on the community as well. So, and look at the highs of 2017, and then we've just fallen away. And of course, 2020 hits, we can see that real decline in the marketplace as well. And that's the same with employment. So we can see we had peak employment in 2017, fell away through to 2021, and then we've seen that increase in both indirect and direct employment from the tourism sector in the Northern Territory, which is really important. And remembering some of those jobs, because tourism looks at retail, accommodation and food services, transport, that sort of thing. It cuts across a number of sectors. We actually aren't able to fill a number of those jobs at the moment. We don't have the skills in our community or the willingness to take up jobs in those sectors at the moment. So certainly we would hope to see that number continue to turn around. And of course, with international migration, we'd like to see some shift in that data as well. So just some final words from me. Okay, the Northern Territory has seen strong growth, particularly when we look at wealth during the period 21 to 22, and that's really being driven by mining. Okay, we need to be wary of project timings. Okay, so that's a lot to do with our construction sector. So a lot of the migration that we're seeing at the moment partially is to fill gaps in our construction sector. But we've also got other pressures in that construction sector around supply chain issues with regards to materials, as well as things like inflation, interest rates, certainly putting pressure on buying a property at the moment as well. Inflation, interest rate changes, putting pressure on our consumer activity in our economies, as well as we start to see the economy slow down a little bit as well, which certainly has an effect on our retail, accommodation, those sorts of sectors as well. Managing housing affordability, rental stress, and new residents is going to be really, really important. Okay, housing affordability, the rental market, the demand for rentals, high entry prices, all really playing havoc with what's happening in our labour markets, but also just, through people trying to find the additional finances to support living in a rental or their own properties, they're fulfilling their mortgages. So it's a really, really interesting time, because I know that even if I wanted to move to Darwin tomorrow for a job, I probably wouldn't be able to find accommodation, which certainly stifles the market. Taking advantage of structural changes, so the working from home is going to be really important. The other thing that's happening at the moment is education is coming back. So really thinking about what role does the NT play in that, and how do we entice students back to Darwin. Grant and funding opportunities are increasingly available, so really hooking into those government agencies that are offering those programs, and remembering that, and I know lots of you guys online have contacted me direct about using the economic impact model. Continue to do that. There is an economic impact model that the RDA has, and certainly that is something that you need to touch base with Jacqueline and get support in using that model to support your grant applications, because that's what we want to see. We want to see more funding go back to the regions. And of course, I spoke about it before, but international migration and visitors on the way back, how do you guys play a role in making sure that the NT is part of their visitation program, or essentially part of their work program, so that you can get those guys into the NT as well, rather than just Sydney and Melbourne. Okay, so that's everything from me. There's my email address and my phone number. Please take a note of that if you want to get in touch. For those of you in local governments all over the NT, certainly if you want a State of the Regions presentation for your area, you can get in contact. I'm happy to provide that for you guys as well. So any questions?